What's up, everybody? This is part 3 of the Maison project. Let's go.
Like, ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky, come get high with me, that's a deal, right? Ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky, come get high with me, that's a deal.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Maison project. This is part 3. And if you are new to the series, if you're just catching this video, if it came up on your feed and you're like, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to try it anyway, and you don't know what's going on, well, I encourage you to go ahead and hit pause in this video, click somewhere above here, and it's going to take you back to part 1. This is part of a video series that I am doing to chronicle the trajectory of a bottle of wine. So how does wine age? And it's a question that I was asked often as a sommelier on the floor. What is the difference between a bottle of wine that's on the newer side and the bottle of wine that has a little bit of age on it? What are some of the things that a wine can do? So how does it change? What are some of the textural differences? How does it taste different? We wanted to look at a wine over the course of its life, over about a year or so, maybe longer than that. We'll see how it goes. But we wanted to check in every month to see how a wine changes, because a wine doesn't just change in one straight line. It's more like a sine wave, right? Like it moves up and down. There's lots of curves. Tons of things can happen throughout the course of a wine's life. And I wanted to check in on that, show you guys what it can do. Wine can change really, really dramatically. It was one of the things that I loved checking in on the regular when I was a sommelier on the floor at Press. Wines change every single day. So we wanted to look into this and see what was going on. So this is part 3. We check in every single month thus far. So it's been the 15th of every month. Today is June 15th. It's about 4:30 p.m. and I'm checking in on this wine to see what's going on. Let's do it. Now, one of the things that I don't do is go back and check my notes. I don't go back right before I open this bottle of wine to see what I thought a month or even the month prior to that. And the reason I do that is I don't want to be swayed. I don't want my mind to remember all of the specific details of what I thought this wine was drinking. I really want to have a fresh perspective. So to that end, I don't go back and watch these until I'm editing and I'm going back through. At some point, maybe I'll put them all together and give you sort of a highlights reel. But for the time being, I wanted to stay fresh and just check in on it as I would normally. Cork smells good. And you may remember this wine is a wine I discovered via the Viticole Wine Club. This is a different vintage of this wine. This is all coming from Napa Valley, from vineyards that Steve Mathiasen farms. And it's a very small project. The wine is available. If you head below to the description, you'll find a link there and you can purchase the wine if you want to play along. And they also make a lot of other wonderful wines as well. It's a very classically styled wine. It's one of the reasons that I chose this wine to do this project with. They also were incredibly helpful in giving me a case to make sure this could all become possible for your viewing pleasure. So a huge shout out to those guys for making this possible. See how it's doing. This is not 100% Cabernet. This is a little bit of a blend, but it's mostly Cab. I have not decanted this wine. I just opened it, so it had no air, which is keeping the variables of this project constant. We don't really want to change too much about how we're tasting this wine. Variables such as different glasses, how much air a wine gets, the temperature that it's at, even my own personal palate and what time of day can change how a wine is tasting. So we try to eliminate as many of those as possible. Obviously, not every variable is possible to be eliminated, but we do our very best. Now you may notice that I have not swirled the wine. I don't like to give it any air for that first nose. I just like to see how it's doing without that first swirl. Is moving into a slightly more evolved direction. So whereas the wine initially, the fruit was a little bit more high-toned, it smelled like you maybe just plucked the fruit right off the vine or right off the bush, whatever type of fruit we were getting. Now we're starting to get into that point where the fruit has been plucked off, it's been sitting on the counter, and it's getting a little bit more of a ripeness to it. I can't totally remember if we were getting that the last time, but definitely getting a lot of this like really pretty soft summer berry fruit. There is just a touch, very small touch of herbaceousness. So a little bit of like a sweet sage, but again, like this is smelling very California today. And I think that's a really good thing. I really am loving where the aromatics are at with this wine. I'll be curious to go back to this wine after I taste it again to see if the nose changes. I think right now, out of the gate, I'm getting so much freshness and so much fruit and so much youth and vitality. I'll be very curious to see if the palate has moved in the same direction, if it's following suit, because a lot of times you can have your nose and your palate be a little bit different. They don't necessarily evolve at the same pace. They have not evolved at the same pace. Very interesting. So the fruit part of the equation is matching the nose, but the texture of this wine feels much, much more evolved. It's really starting to bring out some of those undercurrents, some of those layers. So if you think about the trajectory of a wine's life, wines really start in the bottle, right when they're bottled, as really fresh, vibrant expressions of that fruit. There's no evolution. There are a lot of baby fat, and that can manifest in a lot of different ways depending on the variety, depending on how it was made, depending on where it came from. But mostly, young wines, young red wines, are going to be vivacious. They're going to be very fruit driven. Very rarely are you going to have a wine that right out of the gate, you're getting deep into those earthen sort of flavors, that underbrush, that overturned earth, all of that nerdy stuff that you hear that isn't fruit. So as a wine evolves over the course of months or years or even decades, some of that young baby fat, that young fruit, starts to sort of peel off, and it gives way to some of the more earthen characteristics of secondary and tertiaries, the things that didn't necessarily exist before. But it's a process, right? And it doesn't necessarily happen at an even pace. You don't have, the pulling off of the fruit and the undercurrent and the secondary and tertiaries coming in at the same time. Sometimes you have like a little bit of a gap in between. And so when we talk about wines being a little bit awkward or not really coming into its own, a wine's not ready yet, a lot of times that's what we're referring to, that the wine just hasn't really evolved at the same pace, meaning the fruit hasn't dropped off and the other stuff hasn't come in yet. So you're kind of at this weird sort of awkward teenage year where like not everything is totally developed and a wine hasn't really like reached puberty yet, frankly. So that's kind of where this wine is, I think, right now. That said, you can see the direction a wine is headed. And I think that's really what's exciting about this wine is you're still getting a lot of that really beautiful fruit in the nose, which is great from before, right? Like those are all the things that we love about young wines. But on the palate, you're starting to develop very, very slowly into some of this more underbrush, some of that earthen, some of that leafy sort of secondary, tertiary. What is also interesting is that the tannin of the wine and the body of the wine can really change. And sometimes those two things are one and the same in some ways, but the tannin of this wine is still very much intact. It still has a lot of dryness. So tannin is coming from the skins, and it's coming from the seeds, and it's coming from the oak in this wine. There isn't a ton of new oak in this wine, but you can feel that there is still a little bit of grape tannin that hasn't totally resolved. So you're getting a little bit of that puckeriness, you're getting some of that dryness, and that hasn't totally softened yet. So again, texturally, this wine isn't quite developed yet. And then the body of this wine, that I feel like has progressed a little bit more. The initial shape of the wine, how it coats your mouth, the viscosity, that's starting to drop off just a little bit. And as a wine ages, you expect it to lose a little bit of body. You expect it to lose a little bit of viscosity. It's just a function of age. So some of that intensity and richness that you might get from a young Napa Valley Cabernet, like right now it's 2020, so we're really drinking 2017s and 2018s. That's what's coming out right now. Those wines are massive. And it's not just tannin, it's fruit, it's richness, it's intensity, it's mouth coat. And so when we think about how a wine ages, we expect a wine to sort of lose that body, to lose that intensity, that richness that it had as a young wine. It was one of my favorite things about some of these older wines that I was serving at Press in the 60s and the 70s in Napa Valley, wines that likely started just like this, rich and full and intense and coated your mouth. They turned into these really like soft, sort of ethereal Pinot Noir, light-bodied wines. I mean, you could still feel that there was intensity and there was richness and there was a mouthfeel, but there was something soft about those wines. And so we expect a wine as it ages to sort of lose a little bit of that intensity. We expect it to start to relax a little bit. And that's what this wine feels like it's doing right now. I'd say overall this wine, to me, still has a lot of tannin that's unresolved. It still has grippy tannins, but the body is starting to wane off. It's starting to drop off a little bit, and it wants to evolve so desperately into some of these secondary and tertiary characteristics. It feels like it wants to go into something that's more like a bitter root. It feels like it feels like there's a little bit of like black walnut that wants to come out in here. It feels like there's some like overturned earth. It feels like there's all of these like dark, ominous, intense, earthy things that want to come out of this glass, and they're like just on the edge, but they haven't quite escaped yet. And there's still so much fruit on this wine, but it feels like it wants to just take a back seat for a while and let some of the other things come through. So I'd say right now in its life, this wine, while very, very delicious, is sort of at an awkward stage. It's at a place where not everything is working perfectly in tandem. It's like kind of just like teetering on the edge, and that is a really exciting wine. What's interesting is now after a few minutes, this wine is really starting to pull back even more. It's starting to like come together a bit more. It feels like it almost has like an Amaro quality to it. So some of those bitter roots and bitter extracts that we love about those Amaros that are a little bit like dark and savory, they're amazing after dinner drinks because they just have like sort of a medicinal feel to it. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I know it sounds a little like a pejorative, and when you're thinking about wine, you're thinking about fruit, and there's so much fruit in here still, but it really is balanced by these really gorgeous sort of like orange peel and sort of like almost like a tree bark, but there's a lot of raspberry and there's a lot of strawberry, and even though on the nose that's what's coming out in spades, on the palate it's really much, much more restrained. That is the style of this wine. This wine has never been a big, over-the-top, rich, unctuous Cabernet from Napa Valley. It's always been sort of a classically styled, old world-esque style of wine, something that you might find from the 70s in Napa Valley. What's really interesting is you're starting to see a little bit of a color differentiation. You're starting to see some of the particles start to release in this wine. So I'm getting a little bit of sediment on the bottom here. So not a lot, but just enough to let you know that things are changing. The color of this wine is starting to change a little bit. This is not as deep and not as purple as it once was. It's actually starting to fade into more of like a red and a garnet. So that's definitely a change that I remember. I should also comment on the acid of this wine because I think the acid has been one of the more prevalent characteristics of it. The acid has always been really, really present, and to me it feels a lot more integrated. This is what I'm talking about with this wine, sort of being in this phase where it's starting to just like come together, like it's a sauce that's just starting to like hit a simmer, and in like 20-30 minutes it's gonna start just being like all together and one in its own. And so the acid is really starting to fade into the background and just be there for support rather than it being a prominent feature in the foreground of this wine, which I think is a really nice thing. This wine is, I expect in another month, going to change again very dramatically. I can't totally remember exactly where this was a month ago, but I'll be very curious to see if some of the tannins have been resolved. They're still very much present. The acid is starting to integrate. Body-wise, it's starting to drop off. But we are starting to dig into these secondary and tertiary characteristics, which is really, really exciting. I'm super pumped to see where this wine goes. I hope you guys are too. I hope you're enjoying this experiment as much as I am. And if you have questions and comments below, please let me hear them. Let me hear what your questions are. You know, we can talk ad nauseum about how wines age, what it means. I can go live here if that makes sense as well. But this has been super, super fun. I hope you guys are enjoying it. And until next month, I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful June. I'll see you on July 15th for the next episode, and cheers until then.